Hello everybody, welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here. You are joining us for part 5 of our Franklin scandal coverage. We left off last time with Alicia Owen's comprehensive interview that alleged that Larry King had taken her and other minors on flights across the country to be pandered as prostitutes to both sadists and members of high society. She also mentioned that they had been used as drug couriers and countless instances of heinous abuse and coercion by King and his associates. With Alicia's statement recorded to videotape, the Franklin Committee investigators Gary Caradori and Karen Ormiston began to search for her boyfriend and accomplice, Troy Boner. Caradori located Troy's mother in Council Bluffs, Iowa, who invited him into her kitchen and said that her son routinely bounced between California and Omaha, and that she would contact him on Caradori's behalf. She also mentioned that she felt her son was carrying a great weight on his shoulders that he refused to discuss with her. After a late-night meeting with a confidential informant, Caradori returned home to find that his company's answering service had left a message on his machine at 4:40 a.m. from Troy Boner. He called back and they spoke for nearly an hour. Boner was paranoid and firing questions at the exhausted Caradori non-stop. Was he affiliated with law enforcement? No, he was employed by the Franklin Committee. How did Caradori know about him? Caradori mentioned an informant in a correctional facility, but did not name Alicia Owen. Troy eventually told Caradori that he had suffered severe abuse, but did not want to discuss it over the phone. He suggested they meet at his mother's house the following night to continue the conversation. They ended the call, but 10 minutes later, Caradori's phone rang again. It was Troy. He had called the Lincoln Police Department and asked if Caradori worked for them, and they had said no. Troy said he felt satisfied that Caradori was not a cop, and once again consented to meeting later. Then, a few hours later, at 8 a.m., he called back once more to indicate that he wanted to meet as soon as possible. They agreed to meet at a Denny's in Bellevue, Nebraska, at 10:30 that same morning. Caradori and Ormiston waited for Troy in the restaurant parking lot. A green Gran Torino pulled up, with Troy's mother's boyfriend behind the wheel. Troy cautiously emerged from the car and shook hands with the investigators. He was 6'3", 200 pounds, and wore a leather jacket, designer jeans, and a t-shirt with The Cure's Love Song album silkscreen printed on it. He was agitated and nervous about how busy the Denny's was and suggested they drive to another restaurant nearby. Troy rode with Caradori and Ormiston, and his mother's boyfriend followed in the Gran Torino. He would wait outside in the car, while Troy sat with the investigators and gave them information intending to prove that he was on target. After half an hour, Troy agreed to provide Caradori a formal videotaped statement similar to what Alicia Owen had done previously. After returning home and packing a week's worth of clothes, Troy informed his mother's boyfriend and his fiancée, who lived with them, that he'd be accompanying the investigators to Lincoln. On the drive there, Caradori learned that Alicia and Troy came from very different backgrounds. As opposed to Alicia's intact nuclear family, Troy's absent father had spent years in prison for various offenses. In Lincoln, they stopped at a Residence Inn, picked up some pizza and videotapes, and then after eating, Troy signed the waiver and they began the formal interview. The session ran from 3:35 p.m. to 10:22 with breaks and respites. The next morning, Troy was interviewed for an additional 2 hours. In his videotape statements, Troy corroborated Alicia's information on numerous perpetrators and many events. However, Caradori noted a number of discrepancies concerning dates and precise locations of events. Alicia had admitted to drug and alcohol abuse, and Troy was a self-confessed addict. Caradori felt that this was affecting their recall. Troy said that his nickname in King's crew was Mr. Hollywood, presumably because of his good looks and flashy persona. Nonetheless, despite the Mr. Cool persona, as he recounted his history with Larry King and confronted the horrors of his life, he became increasingly uncomfortable. He recalled that he was first introduced to Alan Bayer, one of King's associates, by a friend in August of 1983 when he was 17, though in actuality he would have been 16 at this time. He relayed that he had a number of paid sexual encounters with Bear at his Twin Towers apartment before meeting King. According to Troy, Bear said that he had given King pictures of him prior to the initial meeting at the gay bar. At that meeting, King introduced himself as Chuck and tucked a $100 bill in Troy's shirt pocket. King took him to dinner, and then they drove to a Red Lion Inn where Troy performed oral sex on King for an additional $50. Afterwards, said Troy, King put him up at a travel lodge for 3 weeks and would routinely stop in on afternoons to have sex with him. He alleged that King was fond of being urinated on during these encounters. Eventually, he said, King provided him with a furnished apartment in Omaha where King would continue his visits either to have sex with Troy or with other minors. Troy corroborated Alicia's accounts of the parties at Twin Towers, the abuse she suffered at the hands of Omaha Police Chief Robert Wadman, Larry King, and others, as well as Alicia's revelations regarding interstate pandering of underage prostitutes and their use as drug couriers. He mentioned, like Alicia did, that they had bought $4,000 worth of cocaine in L.A. for Ellen Bear and took it back with them on a commercial flight, and he corroborated her allegations regarding the extremely sadistic associates of King's in Pasadena, to whom she thought a prepubescent child had been sold. Troy offered a slightly different version of this story. He said that in Pasadena, Alicia and another boy named Danny King, no relation to Larry, were taken to sadists, while he accompanied Larry King as he dropped off the 2 prepubescent boys at 2 other different locations. Troy had difficulty responding to questioning about these little boys, turning his head to the side, sighing, and making nervous gestures. Ultimately, he said that he believed those younger kids to have been sold. Troy said that when he and Larry King picked them up following their ordeal, Alicia looked and smelled terrible, and that Danny looked like he wanted to go back and kill the guy. Alicia refused to talk on the flight back to Omaha. Troy felt terrible and wanted to report Larry King after the trip, but he was afraid to contact law enforcement due to King's connections. After the interview, Troy told Caradori that he was trepidatious about returning to the Omaha area, so Caradori rented a small apartment in Lincoln for him. Caradori later said that Troy was accustomed to living the high life. Troy boasted of $1,000 suits and $500 shoes, but he never even washed his own clothes. When they went out to eat, Caradori would order a cheeseburger. Troy would order a T-bone steak. Next, Caradori met with Senator Schmidt. He caught him up on the information he had obtained through Owen and Boner's statements and expressed his concerns about the FBI. They discussed whether or not they should go public or proceed directly to Washington, D.C., because they both felt that influential agencies of both state and federal law enforcement in Nebraska were corrupt and antagonistic to their objectives. The meeting concluded with indecision. The next day, Caradori and Troy drove to Danny King's apartment in Omaha. Troy knocked on the front door. Danny answered and was wary of the stranger with his friend, Troy. Troy stepped inside and spent a few minutes alone with Danny, explaining Caradori's intentions. Suspicions allayed, Caradori was invited in. The apartment and Danny were a mess. Danny admitted that he was recovering from an LSD spree, and he was shocked by the sudden arrival of Troy and Caradori. Danny was 20 years old, short, frail, skinny, with a boyish face, and, due to a congenital throat condition, he spoke with a guttural rasp. The son of a single nomadic mother, he grew up with little supervision, even less than Troy. He was unemployed and in the process of being evicted. Caradori had him pack up his belongings, all of which fit into a bulging vinyl suitcase. As the 3 climbed into Caradori's car, Danny started volunteering details about his abuse, but Caradori politely asked him to refrain from the subject. On the drive back, Danny sat silently in the front, and Troy sat in the back, occasionally reassuring him. Everything's going to be all right. Nobody's going to hurt us anymore. They got to the CARACORP offices around 11:30 p.m., and Caradori indicated that Troy should return to his apartment, which was just a few blocks away. Before getting a ride from Caradori back to the residence inn for the night, Danny asked Troy, "Did you tell them everything?" Troy responded, "Yes, I told them everything." The next morning, Caradori and Ormiston met Danny for breakfast at the hotel and then proceeded to his room to begin the interview. In front of the camera, Danny became visibly frightened and agitated. He told Caradori and Ormiston that Alicia's and Troy's statements were fabricated, and he wanted to leave. Caradori tried to talk him out of it and assuage his concerns, and Danny admitted that he was afraid of retribution. He disclosed that he had been threatened a few weeks earlier. Eventually, he relaxed and signed the waiver prepared by Ormiston. Danny's story was similar to Troy's. In 1983, at the age of 14, Troy introduced him to Alan Baer. He accompanied him back to Twin Towers to drink schnapps. Eventually, sexual liaisons at the apartment became a weekly occurrence. Danny recalled meeting Larry King at Baer's apartment around April of 1984 and was forced to have sex with him. Danny's version of the Pasadena story differed from both Alicia's and Troy's. He remembered being delivered to a party where he was required to perform oral sex on a man instead of at a hotel. However, he corroborated the accounts of the flights and various meetings with King's associates and the names of his henchmen. Caradori noted that Danny was very disoriented and had difficulties remembering that, for example, January followed December. Nick Bryant notes that he later met Danny himself and had the same impression. Danny provided flawed recollections of even relatively straightforward events. The videotaping took approximately 6 hours, including periodic breaks, and afterwards Caradori drove Danny to Troy's apartment. Over the course of the next few days, he shuttled Danny around Omaha and Council Bluffs to identify various locations he had mentioned in his statement. Danny identified Twin Towers and Baer's apartment balcony. Caradori then did the same with Troy, who identified locations he named in his statement. Caradori took photographs of these locations, and both Danny and Troy consistently corroborated each other on the photographed locations. Additionally, the allegations by both Alicia and Danny corroborated Shanetta Moore on one perpetrator, though they had never met her. Shanetta alleged that the administrator for the Fort Calhoun school system accompanied Larry King to his pedophilic orgies. Alicia and Danny both identified the same individual as a frequent guest to the parties. Alicia, Troy, and Danny all corroborated Euless Washington on the chartered flights. And finally, Alicia and Troy also corroborated Euless on the entanglement with Boys Town in King's pandering network. By mid-December of 1989, Caradori had accumulated around 21 hours of victim testimony from Alicia, Danny, and Troy. Paradoxically, Caradori notes in his reports that as he amassed more evidence, there was an increasing dissonance between himself and the committee members. Confronted with mounting evidence, the committee did not know where to turn because of their distrust of state and federal law enforcement. The U.S. Attorney General's office was not cooperative. Meanwhile, Caradori was very concerned for the well-being of the 3 kids. In addition to renting the apartment for Troy and Danny, he purchased food and toiletries for them. He requested physicals, counseling, and secure living arrangements for them from the committee counsel, Barry. Soon after making these requests, 2 investigators from Nebraska State Patrol made a visit to Alicia at the York Correctional Facility on December 15. Soon after making these requests, 2 investigators from Nebraska State Patrol made a visit to Alicia at the York Correctional Facility on December 15. This visit elicited an alarming phone call from her to Caradori. He drove to the prison that night, but arrived too late in the evening to be granted entry. He returned again the following day and talked to Alicia. She said that NSP investigators interviewed her in the warden's office, and that they were menacing to her and degraded Caradori. She said they told her the Franklin Committee did not exist. Caradori checked the prison's logs and noted 2 NSP investigators signed in at 9:29 a.m. and signed out at 3:15 p.m. The committee had not yet handed over the videotaped statements to state and federal law enforcement, so he surmised that Alicia's whereabouts had been gleaned through wiretaps. Caradori feared that the NSP investigators' presence at the prison and their interrogation of Alicia would generate rumors about her being a snitch, and indeed 6 weeks later, 3 inmates attacked her in the shower room. The state ombudsman's office investigated the assault and concluded that the attack was motivated in part because of some of her fellow inmates thought that she might be an informant against the women at York. Their investigators wrote, "We did not find, in our dealings with her in this matter, that she engaged in any exaggeration or magnification of the facts, nor did we detect any attempt on her part to stretch the truth or to falsely color the facts surrounding the assault upon her. Shortly after the assault, Owen was placed in 24-hour lockup segregation for her own protection. She would remain in solitary for nearly 2 years." 3 days after Alicia's assault, the committee held a press conference in Lincoln to announce that it would hand over the 21 hours of videotaped testimony to Nebraska's Attorney General and the U.S. Attorney for Nebraska. They also publicized a letter to accompany the tapes. In it they said, "It is the opinion of committee members that the activities described and the personalities involved scream out for action whether the statute of limitations problems are involved or not. Whether the statute of limitations problems are involved or not." The letter also alluded to the possibility of others covering up crimes. The members of the committee are dismayed by the fact that no state or federal investigative bodies interviewed any of the witnesses we have, even though they were discovered by our investigative efforts after a fairly short time and with a very small budget. The committee directed Carricord to condense the statements into a 5-hour video to show select officials within Nebraska's judiciary and law enforcement on December 19. These officials included Assistant Attorney General William Howland, an NSP official from their criminal division, the sheriffs of Douglas and Butler counties, and a Douglas County judge. The committee hoped to marshal support from them before surrendering the tapes to state and federal law enforcement. In fact, the sheriff of Douglas County did later tell the Lincoln Star-Journal that he found the testimonies credible. The full 21 hours was submitted to the state and federal attorneys general on December 27th. Forced to act, the Nebraska Attorney General Robert Spire pledged immediate action by the NSP and called upon the Douglas County judges to impanel a grand jury to probe the allegations of child abuse. Caradori had effectively showed his hand. Not a month would pass before the media onslaught began, the first salvo fired by John DeCamp. On January 18 of 1990, DeCamp sent a memo to the Omaha World Herald and the Lincoln Journal stating that the public was rapidly losing faith in its fundamental institutions of government because of the way that law enforcement entities conducted their investigations into the allegations. The DeCamp memo then listed Larry King and 4 other prominent Nebraskans as the centerpieces in a coordinated program of child abuse. He claimed that the names in his memo were not garnered through the committee, nor had he watched Caradori's videotapes. He claimed that the 5 names were a ubiquitous buzz in Omaha's bars and coffee shops and on the city's street corners, even though the names had been quietly and carefully covered up by the press. A reporter, the memo declared, has to be deaf, dumb, blind, and corrupt not to know the names of the personalities involved and the scope of the allegations. In addition to alleging a media cover-up, DeCamp threw down a challenge to the press. Now, when the personalities are the most powerful media people in the state, who hold the ability to destroy your reporting careers, let's see the same press coverage and exposure and investigative reporting that you are capable of when dealing with the lesser people of the state. Moreover, DeCamp challenged the 5 prominent individuals to sue him. "No, I do not fear a lawsuit. I fear, just like any alleged child victims in this bizarre tragedy, that the rich and the powerful will use their positions of power and control of institutions of government to shut up those who would speak out and bring things to a head." The newspapers reported on the memo, but they did not identify the alleged perpetrators named by DeCamp. Instead, they published a collage of quotes dispensed by the committee members excoriating DeCamp for disclosing those names. DeCamp claimed 2 events triggered the memo: a conversation with Nick O'Hara, the special agent in charge of the FBI's Omaha field office, who had warned him that anyone casting aspersions on Chief Wadman's character would be subject to the wrath of the FBI, and an article in the Lincoln Journal about Shawnetta Moore, whom he had wanted to represent. She was quoted in the article saying, "He wants to sue the police department in the state for, negligence." The DeCamp memo had a seismic impact on the Nebraska airwaves. An Omaha radio personality allowed a caller to recite the names mentioned in the memo, and she was fired shortly thereafter. A candidate for the Nebraska legislature also mailed 10,000 copies of the memo to registered voters in his Omaha district. The memo brought attention from out of state. The Kansas City Star reported on the memo, and Newsweek mentioned it in a minor blurb. The spectacle showed no sign of dissipating. On February 7, President George H.W. Bush came to town in support of a fundraiser for fellow Republican Governor Orr. Larry King prominently displayed a picture of himself with Bush at the Franklin Credit Union and had considered him a personal friend. Larry King had prominently displayed a picture of himself with Bush at the Franklin Credit Union and considered him a personal friend. As mentioned in an earlier episode, King had hosted a $100,000 gala for the newly nominated Bush at the 1988 Republican Convention in New Orleans. A source informed Caradori that King had purchased a ticket to the fundraiser, although the event's organizers would later deny it. This source had also told Caradori that the Secret Service quickly ushered King to the federal courthouse upon learning of his plans to attend. At the conclusion of this impromptu appearance before U.S. Magistrate Richard Kopf on February 7th, Kopf ordered King to undergo a mental health evaluation at the U.S. Medical Center of Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, with no delay. King waived a hearing on the ruling and was taken to Springfield in the custody of 2 U.S. Marshals. When questioned about this unusual ruling, Kopf offered no explanation and simply stated, "The decision speaks for itself." Senator Chambers, ever outspoken, did not buy it. Powerful people at the national level, he surmised, have more to gain by Larry King being eliminated than standing trial. People of sufficient power to cause him to be sent to Springfield in the first place. His colleague, Senator Schmidt, also felt that the circumstances were very suspicious. People who knew him were confused by this turn of events, and did not feel that King had showed signs of mental problems. His pastor said he is a man under stress and is coping with it the best he can. I thought under the circumstances he was doing pretty well. I didn't see any indications of mental problems. Springfield's chief psychiatrist diagnosed King with probable delusional paranoid disorder, grandiose type. King was returned to Omaha on March 18, and 2 weeks later found himself again in front of the same Magistrate Kopf, who ruled that King's intellectual system of grandiosity leads to disorganization of thought processes, which gravely impairs the ability of Mr. King to withstand a lengthy trial. In other words, King was declared unfit for trial, and his psychiatric report was sealed. The U.S. District Judge William Cambridge, who was slated to be King's trial judge for his financial charges, followed suit, and also found him incompetent to stand trial. He ordered that King be taken to the U.S. Medical Facility in Rochester, Minnesota. There it would be determined if King had the capacity to permit the trial to proceed in the foreseeable future. King spent 5 months in Rochester. His stay coincided with those of evangelical televangelist Jim Baker and his cellmate, fringe political activist Lyndon LaRouche, as well as that of Joey Aiuppa, the former capo of the Chicago Mafia. An interview with a former federal prisoner who served time at Rochester with King told Bryant that King did not display the slightest signs of mental instability and that other high-profile criminals made an effort to steer clear of him. Meanwhile, back in Omaha, the World Herald columnist Peter Citron was arrested for the felonious sexual assault of 2 children. 2 boys, aged 11 and 13. They lived in his neighborhood and they, quote, did chores for him. Rumors about Citron had circulated through the community and made their way to one of the boys' mother. She asked her son if Citron had acted inappropriately, and the boy said that he had, and that he knew of a second boy who had also been molested. That same night, the OPD executed a search warrant of Citron's home and found a huge collection of gay child pornography, including 8mm films, videos, pictures, and magazines. Citron spent the night in jail and was released the next day without bail at the request of Douglas County Deputy Attorney Bob Sigler. Citron's lawyer made a lot of noise in the press, denying Citron's connection to the Franklin scandal. Requests by the Franklin Committee that they be provided evidence on the Citron case was rebuffed. It was contended that the committee would jeopardize the investigation of Citron and also the upcoming grand jury investigation. Citron would plead no contest on 2 counts of felony child molestation. He claimed this was to spare himself and the 2 boys the trauma of a trial. Under the plea agreement, he would be absolved of additional charges stemming from the seizure of his case of child pornography. He was sentenced to between 3 and 8 years in prison. By the time of the arrest, Caradori had been on Citron's heels for some time. A CI that had done consulting for the Franklin Credit Union disclosed that King had instructed his secretary to get Citron on the phone during a meeting. An interview with a social services supervisor revealed that it was common to see Citron in the company of, quote, little boys, but Citron's activities had not been scrutinized further by their department. He said that he had no good answer for that. In a third interview with a 27-year-old woman, she described horrific abuse at the hands of Citron, beginning at the age of 13. She said that she was regularly forced to accompany her father to a church in Omaha or a location in Lincoln where she suffered abuse at the hands of men who took turns having their way with her. On one occasion, she was delivered to Citron's hotel room. There he became enraged that her father had furnished him with a little girl instead of a little boy, and he demanded that he be given her brother. She said her father battered her for disappointing Citron. In the wake of Citron's arrest, big changes went on at his employer, the World Herald newspaper. After 2 decades as its CEO, Harold Anderson, friend and supporter of Larry King and also identified as a participant at his parties, stepped down. Before his resignation, Anderson and his wife were honored by the Nebraska Society of Washington, D.C., receiving the annual Distinguished Nebraskan Award, which was the first time a couple was honored with the award. Nebraska Senator J.J. Exxon presented the award to Harold Anderson, and Governor Kay Orr presented the award to Anderson's wife. The ceremony included a tribute letter from President George H.W. Bush, who praised Anderson's efforts to improve the quality of life in his community and described the World Herald as an example of journalistic integrity. The wagons were circling Caradori. He began using payphones and other covert measures to evade surveillance by the FBI and others. However, he could not dodge the heavy negative media attention that the World Herald and other media outlets were trying to bury the investigation with. After the announcement declaring the production of 21 hours of videotaped statements, the media began to criticize the expenses incurred by the state in hiring Caradori for the investigation. The Nebraska Secretary of State scrutinized the billing and found that, according to Caradori's contract, they charged $24 an hour for investigative reporting and $7 an hour for clerical support. Caradori wrote a letter to the Secretary, thanking him for the opportunity to clarify his handling and billing of the investigation and reminding him that as a private investigator, his rate would have been anywhere from 2 to 4 times higher. Caradori was then slapped with its first federal subpoena. They were ordered to shred all evidence regarding individuals named in the DeCamp memo. Somehow, Omaha's KMTV Channel 3 had obtained a copy of the subpoena and broadcast excerpts of it. This would be the first of many leaks to the media of this nature. The World Herald then ran an article reporting that one of the accusers in the videotape statements was incarcerated on a felony charge. It clearly described Alicia Owen, but it did not name her. Another article shortly thereafter reported similarly on Troy Boner. A week later, it published a second article concerning Owen, describing her run-ins with the law and her mental problems. Later, they would publish yet another article about Alicia Owen, an interview with the state's outgoing corrections director, who flagrantly disregarded Alicia's confidentiality and speculated on her motivations in providing the formal statement. She believed that Alicia had been promised to have her sentence reduced in exchange for her involvement in the child abuse probe. This stands in direct contradiction with the waiver that she signed prior to the interview, which explicitly stated that no promises had been made. The following month, the FBI and NSP raided Alicia's cell and seized a number of her personal belongings. The World Herald and the Lincoln Journal both then began to run articles criticizing, on the basis of an anonymous source, that CARICOR had not used lie detectors or that the alleged victims had failed lie detector tests. Members of the Concerned Parents group picketed the newspaper, touting signs that read, "Lie detector tests for victims, lie detection for suspects." As the media chewed up the public image and credibility of the investigation, a new strategy was also deployed. Omaha's KETV had somehow acquired the tapes and had allowed J. William Gallup, an Omaha defense attorney, to view the tapes at their station. He exclaimed that he was shocked by Caradori's methods and accused him of leading the victims. In a speech to the city's Rotary Club, he called Alicia Owen a short, fat, ugly girl, and the World Herald quoted him as such. He quickly became a media darling and routinely provided sound bites. From then on, KETV began to broadcast on nearly a nightly basis excerpts from the tapes, with the victims' faces scrambled. Other stations also acquired the tapes, and the spectacle was on in full force. The victims' darkest secrets were being aired in public, and their reputations were being maligned every day on every channel. It was a show of power to the victims, and made it nearly impossible for Caradori to coax any further victims from the shadows. Starting in March, the FBI had arranged to interview Danny King and Troy Boner themselves. The two boys had not yet signed federal immunity agreements, as Alicia Owen had done. The FBI began their interviews with Danny. He was interviewed on March 1st and then again on March 2nd. On both days, he recounted his story in basically the same way that he had recounted them to Caradori. On March 5th, however, he began to recant his story. He said that the stories of interstate flights to LA and Kansas City, where he and Alicia had been pandered, were fabricated. Then, he told the FBI agents about his relationship with Alan Baer. He also told agents that Troy had visited him the night before his interview with Caradori, and that Troy had stated that he should make up stories about the interstate flights. The FBI debriefing stated that the motives behind this was to sue Larry King and Alan Baer so they would get, quote, a lot of money. Later, it was explained that Owen was involved in order to get herself out of jail. Troy and Danny's lawyer, Pamela Vucetich, described to the FBI the next day on March 6th that she had spoken with Danny's mother's boyfriend, who had discussed with Danny and Troy the possibility of recruiting another victim. But, with millions and millions of dollars at stake, that it was better not to divide the pie any further. Vucetich brought Danny back to the FBI 2 days later on March 8th. He told his version of the story again, but this time he said that Troy had imparted the fabricated stories to him while Caradori was gassing up the car, not during a nighttime rendezvous. These contradictions did not seem to bother the FBI agents, however. The final debriefing on March 21st had Danny recanting just about everything he had testified to in his statements to Caradori, including his liaisons with Baer. The final debriefing was a cut and paste of the various versions of the story he had given to the FBI throughout the month, and the final version included a new twist. Rather than being told to lie by Troy on the eve of the formal interview, or at the gas station behind Caradori's back, Danny now said that after being dropped off at the hotel by Caradori and Ormiston, both he and Troy asked for an hour break so that they could go swimming. During that time, he said, they went to the bar, drank some alcohol, and talked. It was during this meeting that Troy told him what to say in his statement. And to clarify, Danny's original statement to Caradori on December 2nd explicitly stated that Troy did not accompany Danny to the Residence Inn. It says that Caradori drove them to Caricor, where he dropped off Troy, who then walked back to his apartment, and then Caradori drove Danny to the inn. Troy had become reclusive and hard to get a hold of after being informed by his attorney, Vucetich, that the FBI and NSP wanted to interview him. On March 5th, Troy phoned Caradori and said that he was having a hard time with Vucetich and had retained a new attorney. He had something he needed to tell Caradori, but not over the phone. They met the next day, and Troy said that a friend of his had recognized a high-ranking official from the U.S. Attorney's Office on TV because that official was a regular at an adult bookstore in Council Bluffs. He said that this official had threatened him with perjury charges and that he was very scared for his safety. He then said that while his own videotape statement was true, Danny's was false. He claimed to have imparted the fabricated story to Danny when they first visited him with Caradori, while he stepped inside and was alone with Danny for those few minutes. Caradori nonchalantly said that he was sorry to hear that Troy had changed his story, but there was no way in hell that they could have concocted that story in such a short amount of time. Troy would later describe in a 1993 affidavit that he had been subjected to a torrent of threats by the FBI agents, and that he had ultimately concluded that he must lie or die. Troy began to unravel. In a new handwritten version of the events, he described telling Caradori in his call back to him after checking with the police department as to whether or not he worked for them, that Alicia Owen was a liar. He described them meeting at a restaurant, deciding that it was too busy and then going to a second, less busy restaurant. There, according to Troy, he told Caradori that this whole thing was bullshit, to which Caradori allegedly responded with zealous insistence that it must be true. Troy said that Caradori pitched to him that Larry King and company were all terrible men, and that he would help them sue them for millions of dollars, and also help get a friend out of jail. And then Troy admitted that he bought the pitch and agreed to give Caradori a statement. He also reported that after his interview, in which he described an interstate flight and the pandering of two little boys, he called Alicia Owen and demanded to be told what was going on exactly. He said that she told him to sit down and relax. If they just cooperate with Gary, they were all going to be rich. Then, he said, she provided him with all the locations, dates, times, and other details he would need to tell the story over the next 20 minutes. Then, he said, Caradori talked to him and showed him pictures of Larry King and others for the next 3 hours. In fact, Troy said that he didn't recognize the picture of King until Caradori identified him as such. Then, Troy said, they filmed the 6-hour statement. Having recounted the story this way, the FBI polygraphed Troy and found he passed with excellent results. Perhaps needless to say, the now official story of the events is full of holes. He said he hadn't met Alicia Owen until 1988 when they began dating, rather than during their mutual involvement with King's pandering network, but apparently he was willing to work together with her on this dangerous scheme of hers. Troy claimed that Karen Ormiston was with Caradori throughout the day of the statement's recordings, and so would have witnessed Caradori's coaching the victims. But she had undergone a full suite of polygraph examinations by then president of the National Polygraph Association in LA, and denied that any such behavior had occurred. And finally, the phone records show that no calls were placed to York or received from York, where Alicia was incarcerated, on the date that Troy claims to have called Alicia from the CARICOR offices. The FBI also descended on Alicia. The prison's visitors register shows they appeared to visit her 10 times during the month of February. Surprisingly, she did not give an inch, despite being in solitary confinement. Owen's refusal to recant was the only pillar left standing for the investigation. The media had undermined the public's trust in the investigation and made ubiquitous the leaked videotapes of the victims, intimidating any further victims from coming forward. Troy and Danny's testimonies had been recanted. Larry King was safely tucked away in a psychiatric facility, and the evidence collected during the Citrone case was unusable in court, thanks to the conditions of Citrone's sentencing. Caradori had stepped into the ring with the feds, and after their opening salvos was left with nothing but a list of leads, 271 names long, people who may have been victims, perpetrators, or witnesses. Alright guys, that will do it for this installment. We are coming close to the end here, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks for listening.